Dear viewers, most welcome to my channel NAGA World Conflict Zone. Context: Israel and Palestine. United Palestinians have changed the course of history. The Palestinians revolt to 2021 will go down in history as one of the most influential events in irreversibly changing the collective thinking in and around the Palestine. Only two other events can be compared with what had just transpired in Palestine: the revolt of 1936 and the First Intifada that began in 1987. The general strikes and rebellion of 1936 to 1939 were momentous because they represented the first unmistakable expression of collective Palestine's political agency despite their isolation and humble tools of resistance. The Palestinian people rose up across the country to challenge both British and Zionist colonialism. The Intifada of 1987 was also historic. It was the unprecedented collective action that unified the West Bank and Gaza in response to Israeli occupations of what remained of historic Palestine in 1967. That legendary popular revolt, though costly in terms of blood and sacrifices, allowing Palestinians to regain the political initiative and once again speak as one people. That intifada was eventually thwarted by the signing of the Oslo Accord in 1993. For Israel, Oslo was a gift from the Palestine leaderships that allowed it to suppress the Intifada and use the then newly invented Palestine Authority to serve as a buffer between the Israel military and occupied oppressed Palestinians. Since then, the story of Palestine has been on a dismal trajectory. One of the disunity, factionalism, political rivalry, and for the privileged few, massive wealth. Nearly 4 decades have been wasted on a self-defeating political discourse centered on American Israel priorities, mostly concerned with Israeli security and Palestine terrorism. Old but befitting terminology such as liberations, resistance, and popular struggle were replaced with the more pragmatic language of peace process, negotiation table, and subtle diplomacy. The Israeli occupations of Palestine, according to the misleading discourse, was depicted as a conflict or a dispute, as if basic human rights were the subject of political interpretations. Predictably, the already powerful Israel became more emboldened, tripling the number of its illegal colonies in the West Bank along with the population of its illegal settlers. Palestine was segmented into teeny, isolated South Africa style Bantustans, each carrying a code: Area A, Area B, and Area C, respectively, and the movement of Palestinians within their homeland became contingent on them obtaining various colored permit from the Israeli military. Women forced to give birth at military checkpoint in the West Bank. Cancer patient dying in Gaza while waiting for permission to cross the better equipped hospital and other similar scandal became the everyday reality of Palestinians and the Palestinians. With time, the Israeli occupations of Palestine became a marginal issue on the agenda of international diplomacy. Meanwhile, Israel cemented its relationships with numerous countries around the world, including some of the southern hemisphere that historically stood beside Palestinian. Even the international solidarity movement for Palestine's right became confused and fragmented, a direct expression of the Palestinians' political confusions and fragmentations. In the absence of a unified Palestinian voice amid the prolonged political feud, many took the liberty of the lecturing Palestinians on how to resist, what solutions to fight for, and how to conduct themselves politically. It seems that Israel had finally gained the upper hand. Permanently desperate to see Palestinians rise again, many, including intellectuals and political leaders, also called for a third intifada. It was as if the flow of the history in Palestine adhered to fixed academic notions or was compelled by the urging of some individuals or organizations. The rational answer was the remains, and only the Palestinian people will determine the nature, scope, and directions of their collective action. Popular revolts are not the outcome of wishful thinking but of circumstances, the tipping point of which can only be decided by the people themselves. May 2021 become such a tipping point. Palestinians rose in union from Jerusalem to Gaza and every inch of the occupied territories, as well as refugee communities throughout the Middle East. By doing so, they solved an impossible political equations. The Palestinians' problem was no longer that of the Israel occupations of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem alone, but also the Israeli racism and apartheid that have targeted the Palestinian communities inside Israel. Further, it was also the crisis of leaderships and the deep-seated factionalism and political corruptions. When Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu decided on May 8 to unleash hordes of police and Jewish extremists on Palestinian worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque, who were protesting the ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem. He was merely attempting to score a few political points among Israel's most chauvinistic right-wing constituencies. He also wanted to remain in power, or at least avoid prison as a result of his ongoing corruption trial. He did not anticipate, however, that he was unleashing one of the most historic events in Palestinians, one, the, one that would ultimately solve a seemingly impossible Palestinian quandary. True, Netanyahu's war on Gaza killed hundreds and wounded thousands. The violence they perpetrated in the West Bank and in Arab neighborhoods in Israel killed scores. But it was the Palestinians who claimed victory, with hundreds of thousands of people rushing to the street in the wake of the ceasefire to declare their triumph as one unified, proud nations. Winning and losing wars of national liberations cannot be measured by gruesome comparisons between the number of dead or the degree of these destructions inflicted on each side. If this was the case, no colonized nation would have ever won its freedom. Palestinians won because once more they emerged from the rubble of Israeli bomb as a whole, a nation determined to win its freedom whatever the cost. This realization was symbolized by the many scenes of Palestinian crowds celebrating while waving the banners of all Palestinian factions without prejudice and without exceptions. Finally, it can unequivocally be asserted that Palestine resistance scored a major victory, arguably unprecedented in its proud history. This is the first time that Israel has been forced to accept that the rules of the game have changed lightly forever. It is no longer the only party that determines political outcomes in occupied Palestine because the Palestinian peoples are finally a force to be reckoned with. Ramsey Baroud has been writing about the Middle East for over 20 years. Credited.